Frank Graves is an applied social researcher, the founder and president of EKOS Research Associates Incorporated. EKOS specializes in market research, public opinion research, strategic communications advice, amongst other important topics. Now, you likely know Frank from his frequent commentary online and on television, including as part of CBC's election night coverage. His focus for us today will be on the current state of democracy, including voter trust and the emergence of populism in Canada. Frank will certainly also focus particularly on how the pandemic is impacting our quickly changing world and all of these issues. So again, to ask a question, you can use the Q&A tab there at the bottom of your screen. We'll collect a few for afterwards at the end. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Frank Graves.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can hear me. And in the next hour that we have, I'm going to take half of that to present some material. And then we can use the balance to have a discussion and respond to questions. I want to begin with, I have a pretty specific test I've done of public enthusiasm for different forms of democratic renewal and electoral reform, which was actually used a deliberative loop, which is a kind of an interesting feature where people are given a bit more information and allowed to see what other people in the exercise had said, and then to iteratively refine their views. So it's a pretty good insight into where the public really would be on this. But I want to begin with by talking about just what the public outlook it looks like right now. Because in all the years I've done this, I have never seen such profound movements in public opinion and public outlook as I have seen over the past 3 months. And all of the issues that we're looking at, including the future of democracy, are going to be seen through the prism of what happens as we work through the crisis which has gripped the world and Canada as well. The public tell us that this is in fact the most important event that has occurred in their lifetime, and it's therefore it produces, I think, an important context for understanding how people will respond to issues like democratic renewal. And I do think there are some connections.
Thank you.
Okay. So as I said, I want to start by looking at the public outlook, which I have, it's as interesting as it is frightening to see just how profoundly the public have changed in such a very short period of time. For example, the apparently entrenched regional and partisan divisions, which were really tearing the country apart, really dissipated to a large extent, almost evaporated. We do see them coming back in as the debate, as the question about where to go from here it matures, and people start looking from the initial crisis phase, which we got through okay, to the now the phased recovery pre-vaccine period, which is really going to be a tremendous challenge. But all in all, Canadians tell us that they're experiencing literally a once-in-a-lifetime collision of both economic and health risks, which are highly interdependent. What's interesting, and I think probably not unique to Canada, but even more strongly expressed in Canada and other countries, is the degree to which Canadians have looked overwhelmingly to governments and public institutions to save them. So a lot of the debate, I guess we could paraphrase, there's no atheists in a foxhole, there's no libertarians in a foxhole during a pandemic. The urgency of the crisis has translated into literally the highest confidence we've seen in the direction of the country and of the federal government in over 30 years of tracking this. We see, and it's also produced a similar boost for provincial governments as well. So majorities in virtually all regions of Canada, all demographics express confidence, whereas those confidence numbers would have been much, much more meager just a few months ago. In recent weeks, we see some of the fault lines which grip the country re-emerging, and we mentioned the issue of populism, particularly authoritarian populism, which many Canadians incorrectly believe is not a force in Canada. it was the most important force in predicting the outcome of the last election. I have a paper coming out of that, which someone is bored, you can read in a journal in a little while. But we do see this, this type of outlook, which really has some unique features. It's anti-science. It's not particularly interested in the external world. It wants to pull up the drawbridge, turn back the clock, all of those kinds of things which have propelled Trump to victory, to the Brexit results and so forth. They're working here, and they're very much now re-emerging as part of the contest for the future that will come out of the of this next phase of the pandemic. And I want to point out that if you think, those who think that we may be going back to the status quo and some, the normal which existed before, well, you know what, they might be right, but I don't think that's the case. And when I ask the public, as you'll see, the vast majority of the public believe that we're on the cusp of a major transformation of our society, not just here, of the world, and that this will produce really breathtaking opportunities for innovations and reforms which previously wouldn't have been even imaginable. So I think that kind of source of hope and optimism is something which is important to recognize in a world where right now the levels of stress and anxiety and psychological stress are really unhealthy and high levels. So just a couple of, you can see the dramatic movement up in whether or not the government of Canada, in this case, was moving in the right direction. The numbers that we got immediately out of the lockdown phase were in the 80% range. That is, as I say, if I was to go back and give you these numbers back to the early 90s, that's the highest single score that we've ever seen. Other sorts of things have also changed. When we looked at trust in government, I think I have that here. It also has gone to levels we haven't seen in 10, 20, 30 years. Trust in politicians, scientists, all of those things, public servants, all of those have had a tremendous boost. When the public starts looking back a little bit now, and now we have the data, I'm looking at this every day, and we now see the public continue to believe the governments are performing well, but that's come down just a little bit, and some of the regional fault lines and partisan fault lines are re-emerging. I think they're not nearly as strong as you see in the United States. And when the public, and what's one of the things that the public are using, they're measuring our performance against the yardstick of the United States, which frankly they're horrified at. The incidence of people who think governments have made things better during this, in the case of Canada, is a clear majority, about 70%. As we look at, well, what about China? Only 12% think it made it better, but they give even worse marks to the United States at 8%. So those sorts of factors are also coalescing. And I think also they're producing questions about the relative performance of liberal democracies in this era. And that's something we're going to have to wonder how that's affected, particularly, for example, what's gone on in the United States, but also just generally speaking, the performance of a lot of liberal democracies with, advanced Western democracies with lots of wealth, lots of scientific ability and prior warning. Many of them have done relatively very poorly compared to some of the more authoritarian regimes, for example. And here you can see the marks that are currently being assigned. You can see that provincial and territorial governments have done well, as has the government of Canada. We move into the World Health Organization, leans positive, but much more mixed. Labor unions mixed as well. But you can see that stark and horrible marks they assigned to the government of China, only eclipsed by even worse marks for the government of the United States. One of the things that might be coming out of this in a positive fashion, there's all kinds of negative stuff and frightening stuff, is a restored sense of social cohesion, of trust, and that public institutions actually can provide, and individuals can have the resilience to deal with these once-in-a-lifetime changes and challenges. And as I said, the most important point I take out of all this right now is that Canadians think that we are on the cusp of a broad transformation. The question of what that broad transformation will look like is really going to become the critical question. And if we think of the last massive economic disruption which would have been on this scale. It would have been the Great Depression. And as we know, there was different responses. In the United States, for example, a New Deal came with an unbelievable transformation that would not have been possible otherwise. Oligopolies, monopolies were dismantled, massive public works problem. Public high schools didn't exist before that. Social safety net imported from Bismarck and Germany, and so on and so forth. We also know that in Europe, it took a very different and darker path. So we have to be very alert to both the positive and darker possible transformative changes that will come out of this. But I think the possibility of seeing electoral reform, or what I prefer to think more of as democratic reform, as a critical part of this transformation, is something we have to think about carefully as we go through this. You can see that this tracks both Canadians and Americans, that there had been a precipitous decline in trust in government in both America and the United States, which worked in lockstep, which plummeted down to as low as 20%. And we see it now. It hasn't gone back to the salad days of the 70s and 80s, where most people, they said they could trust the government in Washington or Ottawa, as this question asks, all or most of the time, but you can see a tremendous movement up. Trust in public service, also, that's the highest score we've ever seen. Politicians, still not a good score, but the cartoonishly low 9% trust in politicians has gone up to, not nosebleed, but 28%. That's a 3 times increase. Different sectors are coming out of this with different outlooks from the public, and it's by no means certain yet. But a lot of the human capital sectors, healthcare, education, have been seen as critical and even more important in the future. Some of the old economy, manufacturing, bricks and mortar retail, oil and gas has suffered a real serious decline in terms of the confidence about its trust and also its place in the future. And that might be also part of this broad conversation of how we want to redesign our society and the balance between health, economy, and for example, environment. And you can see here the question which says, do you expect a return to the status quo, or do you expect a broad transformation? The marks are there quite striking. That contest for the future, I think, will very much emerge along what we call the ordered open axis, which is not the traditional left-right axis, but is this axis which looks at the importance of knowledge, public institutions, receptivity to the external world, importance of health, education, and so forth, versus the other approach, which really is a more authoritarian or ordered approach, which looks backward, says we really need to kind of close our borders or pull up the drawbridge, turn back the clock, take back control, all those familiar bromides. They're very much at work. They're frighteningly at work in the United States. I'm almost despair sometimes about what might happen in the coming months, but those forces are at work in Canada, and I do think that will be the critical axis of debate in the contest for the future that's going to emerge. Now, back to the issue of public views on electoral reform, and I'm going to walk some data that's from a few years ago, but it was a pretty good test, I think. And I'm just going to give you the essential ingredients of this. The public were split on this, but the clear majority want to move forward with electoral reform, which sadly didn't happen in the last election, but I don't think that desire has gone away. And if we can harness it to these new forces out there, I think it could have even a much greater prospect of being successful. A modest majority thought the changes were needed, but that there was a third of those out there that thought the current system was sound, and that tended to be focused mostly on those who felt they were comfortable in their position in the economy and the democracy was working okay for them. It was also very much split on partisan lines. Conservative supporters were very comfortable with the current system. If you really looked outside of that group, then the appetite was much stronger, although split as to what type of electoral reform. There seemed to be, when we looked at the data, 3 dominant principles which were at the essence of an ideal electoral system. First, it should enjoy legitimacy, and that you think would be sort of obvious, but there's been points in recent history where we have really been in the range of a legitimacy crisis. They wanted to produce good government. And I think one of the things which might emerge from this crisis in this transformation is recovery of that anachronistic, but it's still attractive notion of the public interest. And in fact, if we look at the decline in trust in government that's gone on in Canada, the United States, most advanced Western society, the key driver was the sense that the public interest was subordinate to the private interest or the interest of special interest and so forth. I think we may have a chance to revisit that, but indeed the public do see democratic and electoral systems as something which is critically attached to the issue of producing good government. The other thing the public want is they want equality. And in particular, a world where equality in terms of economic outcomes, and this pandemic has laid bare previously hidden injuries of social class in a way that it's actually quite shocking. I don't have time to get into that now. Maybe we'll get into the question mark. But at least in the realm of democracy, all votes should be of equal value. So those are the three dominant principles which seem to underpin outlook on democratic change. You can see when we put the proposition, I don't see any reason to make major changes. There is a group out there. It's the plurality saying, no, I don't agree with that. But you can see that there is a group more rooted in older Canada, conservative constituents, and a little bit more in males. But you can see the appetite for making major changes actually is much stronger as we in the younger spectrum. And millennials will, in fact, they were the largest voting group in the last election and will be even more so as boomers and are become increasingly relax the stranglehold that they have held on elections and polling outcomes for some time. Do you think that Canada's electoral system does a good job in representing the will of voters, doesn't need to be changed? 36% agree. Does it not do a good job? 51% again. So here it's a little clearer. A scant, but a majority nonetheless say it really doesn't do a good job. That's a pretty stark indictment. Now, we tested a number of different descriptions of things, some of them a little more detailed and some of them shorter, just to see whether they change the way people results. So we got similar results, but when you explain, the more you explain first past the post, and one of the problems is that, as you would know better than I, when you get into some of the technical details of operationalizing first past the post, it becomes a much more complicated proposition than just, if you get 50% of the votes, you should get 50% of the seats. But the difficulty in conveying it does produce a somewhat significant but modest reduction in support for it. There is a clear lean to go ahead with some form of proportional representation, which meets the ideal of that more equal democracy. All votes should be equal. Half the votes should be half the power. It will leave certain groups unhappy, but will be a greater unhappiness if those no changes are to occur. So you can see here the support for proportional representation, preferential voting, and first past the votes. And you can see with the brief introduction that by far proportional representation scores the highest, with 43% giving it first marks and second choice 33%. Preferential voting quite a way back, first past the post in third, but not far behind. If you give a little bit more detailed explanation of things, you can see that the same results apply, but that the support for proportional goes down somewhat. There are interesting correspondences or associations across political constituencies or partisanship and support for these things. Proportional representation is scored much higher amongst those supporting NDP, the Green Party. Preferential voting is really embraced by Liberals, who I think recognize that they would do extremely well under that. And first past the post is one that is championed most by the Conservative supporters. So the public I want to point out that the conversation of electoral reform, in my opinion, has greater prospects of success if it's incorporated into a broader framework of democratic renewal. And there are other things that should be looked at as we're looking at the electoral system, in my opinion, and I think the public say that as well. So the public warmed to other innovations such as mandatory voting, which is something which is seen as a solution, which is embraced in greater numbers by Canadians, something that's been used in jurisdictions like Australia since 1924 and produces 90% plus participation. I prefer Denmark's system where they get those levels without mandatory, but I think it's something that should be considered. There's certainly a case for that. The other thing, though, that comes through is that there's a huge demand for making informed, reflective, representative citizen engagement as part of federal governance. And so that's not so much what we do at election time, it's what we do in between. And the citizenry who have seen declining trust, declining deference, are no longer happy with just having a kick at the can every 4 years. They would like a system where citizen views are incorporated on a reflected, informed, and representative basis as an input, not as a determination, but as an input into the way that governments make choices and decisions between elections. Here you can see the support for mandatory voting. You can see it's actually pretty strong and getting higher. We also looked at things like online voting, which I suspect the numbers were rising. I suspect they might have gone down in the aftermath. This is pre-Cambridge Analytica and other types of problems which people have seen in terms of the safety of online. We're having a debate about the safety of mail voting in the United States as well. But that was something that if we could figure it out with blockchain or something and really truly make it safe, it might be something the public would be interested in. But I think it's probably lower priority right now. So this first phase of the research, the public say, we want reforms which will enhance legitimacy, equality, and good government. They didn't think we needed to be reckless or speedy, but there was a will to move forward to the next level. Most Canadians thought that should have happened before the last election. So we'll see how that is affected by some of the really profound transformations going on right now. And I'm going to just give you a quick sense of what happened when we returned to that same random sample of Canadians and told them what other Canadians had said and allowed them to revise their preferences on the basis of that iterative feedback loop. With that new information, we asked the sample to choose a path forward and to make some hard choices. The results resembled the first phase, but there were some important differences. Support for moving forward, interestingly, was strengthened. So the people who've been through the process and seen what other citizens thought about it were even more certain that moving forward was a good idea. And there was an even clearer lean to proportional over preferential. Preferential really kind of lost traction the more that people sort of reflected and saw what others were thinking about it. So should the federal government move forward with replacing Canada's first past the post? Yeah, a 2-to-1 agreement that would be the case. And then for those who said, yes, we should be moving forward, which prefer proportional or preferential, you can see a very clear judgment made by the public that proportional, whatever the technical implementation, would be a better way of going. So fairly strong support. What was interesting is then we gave them forced choices, which included routine citizen engagement. It actually emerged as the number one priority. We've been talking about this for a long time. I fear we're packing our bags for a trip we might never take. And I can't understand what, because the technology for doing this would make this far more capable and effective than in the past. But moving on, strong majorities preferred moving forward on internet ballot. I suspect that might have been tarnished somewhat. There was a modest majority favored compulsory voting. The reflective citizen engagement topped the list, but proportional representation was a clear second. If we took citizen engagement off the list and we're just looking at electoral issues, then proportional representation was the clear winner. But of those, when we were asked which were essential, citizen engagement was seen as the most essential, with proportional coming in second. Again, if it's off the agenda, proportional would have been first. So here's the results of that. And you can see some of the differences between the first phase and the second phase, they were modest, but you know, we did see those significant changes in terms of the overall question of whether we should be moving forward. So to conclude, we are now in the midst of a crisis which has created an unprecedented rise in trust in government and public institutions. There is a great disruption that's been going on, and it seems the public believe that we now have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for doing some things which we've been talking about for a long time, like dealing with climate change, rebalancing our economy so that the hyper-concentration of wealth at the top isn't there, that we understand that some of the social class divisions that have been laid bare, how we treat our seniors, all kinds of things are going to be revisited in a way that they haven't in a very long time. In this democratic renewal, I think would be seen as a critical ingredient of those transformative changes. So that would be my advice, is you really figure out how to harness that in a way that it will fit into this unique opportunity. It's notable that some of the governments seen as having fared most poorly, notably the United States and the United Kingdom, were elected with a minority of the vote, so that might add a little wind to the sails. The confidence in democracy is strong right now in Canada. That's not true in some European countries or in the United States, but I believe it could be shaken by the pandemic. And what I'm seeing in my most recent results is really, really high rise in the level of uncertainty about what's coming forward. I think the broader question of how the world is going to look at, and younger generations, the relative performance of liberal democracies, they're going to need to be retooled to reckon with the harsh reality that their performance in dealing with this, and in a world where it was signaled in advance, the most advanced, powerful economies and scientifically advanced democracies are the ones that actually have done most poorly in many cases. And that will be something I fear will cause a reappraisal of, is there something wrong with the way those democracies are functioning? So that's my presentation. I would be glad to see if there's some things we can talk about now, or questions or clarifications. So I'll stop at this moment.
That's great. Thanks very much, Frank. It's wonderful to see the presentation, and really useful and wonderful to see all that kind of data. It just really helps us think about how we can shape our messaging, our campaigns going forward, and, you know, relate it to so many of the issues that we care about so much. I mean, obviously we're dominated by the pandemic, but I mean, all kinds of social issues and economic issues, environmental issues, and so on. And you can relate it back to the kind of data that on the ground that we actually see. So that's wonderful. Okay, so we do have a number of questions. I'm going to pull up the little tab here, and it's about 5 minutes after 2. We still have about 25 minutes here or so. So we'll see how many we can get through. Okay, I'm going to start with, we have a question from Mark Johnson. He says, market research after the quote unquote failed 2007 electoral referendum in Ontario showed that Ontarians did support mixed member proportional after they understood what it was, even though those who voted decided against MMP for whatever reason. What does that say about our political education and awareness of the public and the efficacy or lack thereof of referendums as a way to decide on electoral reform?
Well, that's an excellent question. And having worked on a number of referendums over the year, they have, and seeing how they work in the world, broader world, they're a fairly blunt instrument, and are essential on certain occasions. I don't believe the plethora of referenda you see in the United States is a good thing, but occasional referenda on key issues. But they do have some real frailties in terms of, most generally speaking, a referendum, if you don't leave the gate with at least 70, 80% support, you're unlikely to be successful, because whatever the proposition you put forward then becomes under criticism or assault from all the other players, and it inevitably loses steam. That's one problem. I also think, interestingly, in both Ontario but in British Columbia as well, where the results weren't successful, support for proportional representation, electoral reform is actually higher in those places now, and majority support than it was, even though despite those failures. So it may be that I think I know that in today's world, the attention span of the citizenry is extremely scant. We don't even have sound bites of 5 seconds now. They used to be a minute. Then they are shrinking. If you can't get your message down on a bumper sticker, your chances of success become increasingly small. And of course, there isn't a way of communicating, a mixed member system in that level of simplicity. So one of the challenges is really a communications challenge to how can you communicate this, at least at the level of principles, in a fashion where it doesn't get lost in that limited attention span out there in the citizenry. I also think, that the ability to harness it to a bigger issue is really going to be critical. And I think that window of opportunity is now open.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we've certainly had our experience with the referendums and all the frustrations therein. So I know a lot of people listening and watching can relate. All right. Okay, we have a question from Sheila Gervais. She says, is there a difference in trust factors between minority and majority governments in Canada? I guess in your research.
That's a really good question. And, frankly, I think, for example, right now, trust in government has soared. Part of that trust is, I think people think the minority government is working pretty well right now. And, I would tend to agree with them. So, but ironically, I didn't present it today because we're on talking about bigger issues, but and nobody's expecting election at any time soon. But if there were to be an election, the Liberal government, which was at this time last year trailing the Conservatives by 12 points, now is leading the Conservatives by 14 points. That's a massive shift. If there were to be an election, which there will be, that would produce, I think, about a 230-seat majority. And would that be a good outcome? I'm sure if you're a Liberal, you'd think that's fantastic. But right now, I think the public are pretty comfortable with the way this current balance of power is working in this government. I'm not saying occasionally if the public say, we want a majority, that'd be great, but ideally it should get about at least half the votes for that to happen, you would think. So yeah, I don't think the public have hard and fast rules about whether they like majorities or minorities. I honestly think you could find cases where people, like right now, the public are showing historically high levels of confidence in government. That's a minority government. Would it have performed as well if it had been a majority, particularly a majority that had been secured with 37% of the vote? Don't know. Hard to say. But I do know that the public will really make that judgment on sort of the quality of the performance of the government rather than whether it's a majority or minority.
Yeah, that's a good point. Me personally, I find that I often forget that we're in a minority situation. People can comment on this in our chat if you like. Do you find you often remember kind of on a day-to-day basis that, oh yeah, it's actually a minority government that we have? I find that I often don't really think about it. Obviously, we're quite preoccupied, but the way the government's been functioning, we don't get a lot of the kind of back and forth battles that you'd often get maybe in a typical minority situation. So it could be particular to the time, but it's an interesting perspective for sure. Okay, we have a question from Kelsey Hannon. She says, have you done any polling on lowering the voting age to 16?
I'd have to guess. I'd have to say I haven't. I think I might have looked at that issue, but I don't have the results readily in my mind, so I'll have to say I don't. My personal view is I think it's a good idea, but it's a controversial idea. but I think it would be something well worth looking into, particularly because I do know this, that that the sooner voters begin voting, they become serial voters, and that's good for democracy. You want voters, the longer they don't become voters, the longer they stay out and they become serial non-voters. So I think the advantages of securing democratic participation earlier would outweigh, and that's just an off the top of my head response, but I think it's something would be well worth looking at.
Okay, question from John Bauman. He asks, which aspects of the current situation do you think we might best point out in order to highlight the value of and need for democratic reforms?
Well, that's a good question. It's a tough one to answer. The thing that came to mind most immediately to me was the problems that we've seen in the United Kingdom and the United States, which have both largely fumbled this in a near catastrophic fashion. The United States seems to be continuing that. The United Kingdom looks like they're making some adjustments and picking up their game. But both of those situations, and indeed the issue, for example, before the last election in the United Kingdom, clearly most voters in the United Kingdom wanted to pull the plug on the Brexit, and they were unable to do so because of the fragmentation of the electoral system, largely due to their first past the post. The United States is a different system but you did have, electoral college system, which took someone who had 3% less of the vote, 2.5% less, and gave them this level of power at a time in history where you couldn't have imagined the worst outcome. So I would imagine both of those would be vivid examples, well understood by the public, of the dangers of not having a system which reflects the overall public interest in a way that reflects equally the value, the votes of all citizens. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure there's others as well.
Yep. Okay, going back into your presentation, you had some numbers about post the last federal election last fall from conservatives. And we have a question from Howard Green. He asks, what was the view/attitude of the Conservative Party after the 2019 federal election toward PR, given they had a plurality of the popular vote but were unable to form government? It kind of expands a bit on some of the data that you presented there.
Yeah, I did some exit polling immediately following the election, and the levels of dissatisfaction with the outcome at that time were very high, and the levels of partisan division were unprecedented. And it's interesting to note that the conservative constituency in the last election was quite different from the historical conservative constituency. A lot of people aren't aware of this. We used a simple index, 4 questions that measured whether someone had an ordered or open outlook. These questions have nothing to do with democracy. They ask questions about child rearing. When you're raising a child, you think it's more important to stress creativity or obedience. Divides the country pretty evenly. You put these 4 questions together, though, and you get a measure of what is called, and we don't use the term because it comes from an explanation of how the Holocaust happened in Europe, and so people get notably, understandably, a little upset. But this index, which we call ordered and open, exactly predicted the conservative vote, and it wouldn't have as little as 5 or 10 years ago. So you've seen incredible levels of polarization, and I use that term carefully, emerge in a very short period of time. I'll give you an example. In 2012, for example, when I asked conservatives and liberal supporters, do you think there's too many visible minorities coming to the country? About 35% of liberals agreed, which is disturbing, 47% of conservatives. When I asked that following this last election, 70% of conservatives agreed, 15% of liberals. It wasn't that liberals have become all that more diverse, pro-diversity. There's been a sorting going on, which we've seen go on in the United States as well. Like the constituents you see for Trump or for Brexit, for example, is not the constituents you would have seen for Reagan in the past, which would have been the affluent, educated, university educated suburban voter. No, it was working class. It was hostile to immigration, it was anti-intellectual, anti-science. So this is a new phenomena that I think has been bred, and to some extent, by democracies which are not performing well in that respect. We've got two Canadas eyeing each other suspiciously from two sides of a cliff with no middle ground. Now we've seen that some of that's been solved temporarily with this crisis, but I believe it's reemerging, and so democratic renewal and electoral reform have to confront that problem very squarely. But yes,
Yep.
do I think conservatives would be a little less, a little more receptive to proportional representation? Probably, but not by much.
Okay, we have a bit of a follow-up, kind of along the same lines, but less focus on maybe conservatives particularly. Anthony Hodgson, who's out in British Columbia, he says, have you ever seen a poll where the public preference for majority governments has been evaluated based on whether or not the majority is held by the party they prefer? I.e., while a majority may prefer majority governments in principle, a significant proportion of that support may evaporate if they are asked if they would like to see a majority held by a party they didn't vote for, that didn't win a majority of the votes. It's kind of a partisan question again.
Well, yeah, and the answer is simple, that yes, everybody, pretty well everybody who has a plausible shot at a majority government, which would include at least 3 parties in Canada over the last 10 years, would really much more prefer that majority would be their party, and most of those would say no. I'd be horrified at the idea of a majority of the other people that I didn't vote for. So yeah, majority support is almost perfectly correlated whether it's my party that would get the majority.
So
There's
this is my own follow-up, but
think, well, majority governments generally work better, so if I have to take the sidelines for a while, that's great. No, that's not how people think these days.
Yeah, that's just it. I mean, this is my own follow-up, but just is there a way that we can message to kind of break through or kind of target the idea that you can have a broader support, something broader than just your own party, broader than just your own interests, and kind of democracy in general, the health of society, that kind of thing?
Absolutely, and I really do think, and I'm not trying to be Pollyannish here, but what's happened in the last 3 months is a recovery of the concept that a public interest is actually something which should be paramount, and that good governments are the way of achieving that. I'd also note that, some of the apprehensions you hear, oh, well, we're going to end up with, the kind of problems that you see in Israel or in Germany and so forth. By the way, Israel and Germany pretty well hit it out of the park here in terms of responding to this crisis. Lots of cooperation was required. Particularly, I'm more familiar with Germany because I've been working on an international group with some of their experts, and they really assembled things extremely well. So the idea that they would be impaired because we didn't have the familiar, majority governments that often had existed in Germany simply wasn't true. So I would think you'd want to stress the fact that that majorities or untethered decision-making capacity don't necessarily have been associated with the places that did best, unless you get into the right out into the realm of authoritarian regimes, which I don't think most Canadians would have any interest in.
No, we don't want to go there. Okay, this is interesting, a bit more of a philosophical kind of question. Carol Gordon asked, doesn't the struggle between first past the post and PR come down to whether people are more comfortable with a powerful person leading and making decisions versus decisions being made through the cooperation of a group of leaders? Is our opinion changing in Canada regarding this?
I think Canadians have become less comfortable with the idea of that it's all about the leader, and that means that that would theoretically favor the idea that collaboration, cooperation actually are possible. By the way, that's one of the things that has emerged in this crisis, is that the level of cooperation across the senior levels of government here, I'm not talking across the opposition parties, but across the provinces and the federal governments and even the municipalities, has really been pretty well first rate in the minds of the Canadians, and I would tend to agree with them. So, but not to belabor the point about the rise of authoritarian populism, but one of the key ingredients of authoritarian outlook is the search for the strong man, the man on the horse who's going to come and save us. And so that specter actually is still very much at play right now amongst the minority of Canadians, but it's a powerful force. So I think the answer depends on what part of the Canadian society we look at to get the answer. Yeah, and it is always a strong man, not a strong woman, although in Canada, it appears that the people who have performed the best in all of this are chief health officers who have been almost unanimously women.
Yeah, and I know we're all looking forward to our next session too with Penny from New Zealand, and she'll certainly talk about the response of their government, of course. Yeah. Okay, well, we've got about 5 minutes. We can get to a few more questions here, I think. Now, this is one that all of us, I think, have struggled with and continue to struggle from time to time as we try to press this issue and talk to friends and family and everybody we know with the opportunity. David Milchart says, how can we simply explain to someone the benefits of electoral reform? How does electoral reform benefit the individual?
I would, and I think that's an excellent question, because I think that is your key challenge. You know, I think the experts would agree, for the most part, that you've thought this through carefully. The evidence internationally, even in Canada, is highly supportive, and the public seem to support it. It seems to falter really on the issue of communication and simplifying it down to the essential principles. So if we go back to the notion of this would enhance legitimacy, this would enhance equality, and this would enhance good governance and the public interest. Those two, in my view, those are the central planks or ingredients of what the communication strategy should be going forward. And there are ones which also provide emotional resonance. And unfortunately, the public make decisions on issues like this on the basis of emotion. There is a rational ingredient, but it's subordinate. So you have to find the emotional hooks. And I think all three of those right now have a high degree of emotional resonance.
Okay, a question from Julien Lamarche here in Ottawa, and I think he's really asking this from a pollster's perspective. So Julien asks, are we able to measure how much strategic voting happens? Are we able to measure it, and how confident are you in that measurement?
I'm sorry, I was looking at the chat thing here.
So, okay, so this is a real, I think he's really looking at this from a pollster's kind of data perspective. Are we able to measure how much strategic voting happens? How confident would you be in that measurement?
I'm very confident, and because I have measured that in exit polling, and I've measured it throughout campaigns on numerous occasions, and I believe it's definitely a factor. But I think it tends to be, in how we measure it in polling, it's a larger factor than it actually is at the end of the day. But I do think it is increasingly a factor, and it's a particularly important factor where you're into a situation where there's the potential for an outcome which is going to be highly unrepresentative of the overall public interest because of, for example, the fragmentation of the center-left vote, which continues to be a problem. So yeah, I think it's a factor, and I think it actually could be mobilized if in a more effective way in the future. I don't think I think if people had a neutral, impeccable source of strong polling data at all the riding levels, and they were asked to, and had that available to inform their decision making, there's nothing wrong with that. People make decisions on all kinds of really bad bases. If they want to spend their vote wisely based on knowledge of what the likely outcome is in their riding, they should be perfectly entitled to do so, and they should have the best possible evidence to do so. The trouble there is the evidence, I can give you a really good picture of what people's voting intentions are at any given point in time, telling you who's actually going to show up. Now you're asking me to give you estimates about an unknown population, which are the actual voters, which can be in many cases 40% or more of the population, and in many cases systematically different from those who actually turn up and vote, as was the case in 2011. Huge difference between the 40% that didn't vote and the 60% that did.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we have time for one more, at least, but Tom Cullen, this is a bit of another follow-up pollster's perspective. Tom Cullen asks, have you seen or are you aware of any analysis of the qualities of the COVID response correlated to the form of government? Maybe that's something to explore in the future.
No, it's a really good question, and I've just given you some sort of conjecture and speculation. I am sitting on an international group of pollsters that are kind of looking at all this, and I believe that that is a question that the answers will become clearer as time goes on. But certainly your presenter from New Zealand may have some observation on that. I mean, they've done an absolutely brilliant response to the pandemic, which continues with the plan, which is par excellence. So yeah, I think that the answer to that, it's an important question. It'll become clearer as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll wrap it up. But this kind of sums up things. Maybe leaves us a bit of a cliffhanger. What do you think, Frank? That will there be a federal election before 2023? And if so, do you think the Liberals would win?
Yeah, well, that's first as a first part, I feel more comfortable answering, and I think yes, there will be. You know, it's unusual for minority governments to endure for the full term. Although I would say this one really probably has a higher chance than any I can think of ever looking at, because it really does produce relative stability when you look at the combinations of the different constituencies, and it so far is performing quite well. But you know, I think someone will get anxious and say, "Oh boy, I have an opportunity here," and so I don't expect it'll secure its full shelf life. I think though you might see some desire to I'd watch what's happening in the U.S. election. I think that may have an impact on the answer to this question, because if we're the mouse sleeping next to the elephant, well, that elephant's now rabid, it appears, and this becomes a really challenging problem, which could be fixed if depending on, to some extent, because I don't discount American resilience, but it really would require a change in government, I think. Right now, yeah, it's a really odd question, because I think the public would say, well, we're really comfortable with, the Liberals are doing a good job, but they're doing a good job in a minority setting. You know, we didn't want to give them the keys to the car without any type of governor, and so we're okay with that. But you know, so that kind of comfort level might actually then give them the keys to the car without a governor if there was an election. But I don't know. I mean, I would think right now the Liberals would probably, if there was an election in say a year from now, and there's so much uncertainty out there that we would have to see what factor that in. I would think they would. I think they'd probably get another minority, as my guess, a strong minority. I think people are pretty comfortable with what they're seeing right now.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, and my goodness, we've got so much to be wary of over the next 6 to 8 to 10 months. Lots of events are going to happen. Events. All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Frank Graves. Thank you very much for joining us and your expertise. We know you've been a supporter of electoral reform and democratic reform, so we appreciate your words and especially your data that backs it up. Thanks very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.